Picture this. October 1873. DeKalb County, Illinois. The autumn wind cuts across the prairie like a knife, bending the tall grass in waves that stretch to the horizon. In the doorway of a modest farmhouse stands a man whose life is about to change the world, though he doesn't know it yet. Joseph Glidden is 59 years old, and if you saw him on the street, you'd think he was just another worn-down farmer. Grey beard, calloused hands, eyes that have seen too much sorrow. But look closer. This is a man who spent 20 years teaching school before he ever touched a plough. A man who believes that every problem, no matter how impossible it seems, has a solution waiting for someone smart enough to find it. 3 years earlier, tuberculosis had taken his wife Lucinda. 3 years of waking up in an empty house, 3 years of eating meals alone, 3 years of wondering if anything he did still mattered. The grief had driven him to make what seemed like a crazy decision. He'd taken his life savings and bought a ranch in Texas. Land of opportunity, they said. Land of endless grass and cattle that multiplied like rabbits. What they didn't tell him about was the rustlers. Every month, like clockwork, they came in the night. Ghosts on horseback who could move 30 to 40 head of cattle without making a sound. Glidden would wake up to find his herd smaller, his investment bleeding away into the darkness, and there wasn't a blessed thing he could do about it. You have to understand this was the world before fences. Oh, there were fences. But they were jokes. Wooden rail fences cost $1.50 per rod. Think about that for a minute. A single mile of fencing would cost over $4,000 in today's money. For a struggling rancher, that might as well have been $4 million. Stone walls? Forget it. You ever try to build a stone wall on the prairie? There aren't any stones. The glaciers had scraped the land flat and left behind nothing but rich soil and grass. Beautiful for growing things, terrible for building barriers. Some folks tried living hedges, rows of thorny Osage orange, that would eventually grow thick enough to stop a determined longhorn. Eventually being the key word. 7 years. 7 years to grow a fence that a smart cow could still find a way through if she really wanted to. So the cattle roamed free, just like they had for centuries. The difference was that now, instead of belonging to everyone, they supposedly belonged to someone. But try explaining property rights to a rustler in the middle of the night. That autumn, Glidden found himself at the DeKalb County Fair, wandering between the livestock pens and farm equipment displays, like a man searching for an answer he couldn't even name. The fair was one of those quintessentially American gatherings, farmers showing off their prize bulls, wives comparing preserves, children sticky with molasses candy. And there, in a corner most people ignored, was Henry Rose demonstrating his latest invention. Picture a wooden rail, nothing special about it except for the metal points sticking out at regular intervals. Sharp little spikes, designed to discourage animals from pushing through. Rose was calling it thorny fence wire, and he was demonstrating how livestock would approach it, feel those metal points, and think better of forcing their way past. Glidden watched, fascinated. Here was a man who'd identified the same problem. How do you keep animals where you want them without breaking the bank? But Rose's solution was clunky, expensive, and frankly, not very effective. A determined steer would push through it in about 5 seconds. Around him, Glidden heard the familiar litany of desperation. Isaac Elwood, the local hardware merchant, was telling anyone who'd listen about losing 200 cattle that summer. 200! Jacob Haish, another local rancher, spoke bitterly of finding his prize bull 20 miles away, already sold to some unsuspecting buyer in Chicago. But it was the stories from the Mexican vaqueros that really got to Glidden. These were men whose families had worked cattle for generations, long before the first American settlers arrived. They spoke of the old ways disappearing, the centuries-old practice of communal grazing becoming impossible as more and more eastern settlers arrived, demanding boundaries, demanding that every acre belong to someone. One old vaquero named Miguel told Glidden something that stuck with him. In the old days, we shared the grass because the grass was bigger than any one man. Now everyone wants to own their piece of sky, but the cattle, they don't understand maps. That night, back in his empty farmhouse, Glidden sat at his kitchen table with his daughter Elva. She'd come to visit, worried about her father living alone, worried about the money he was losing, worried about the distant look that came into his eyes sometimes when he thought no one was watching. They talked late into the night, father and daughter, about problems and solutions, about the difference between what people wanted and what they actually needed. Glidden's teaching years had taught him something important. The best solutions weren't usually the most complicated ones. They were the elegant ones, the simple ones that made you slap your forehead and say, "Why didn't I think of that?" As they talked, Glidden found himself twisting a piece of smooth wire between his fingers, just fidgeting, the way some people doodle or tap their feet. But his mind was working, connecting dots, seeing possibilities. The next morning, he went to his workshop, really just a corner of the barn, where he kept his tools and started experimenting. Using Lucinda's old coffee grinder, he modified it by adding a second shaft. The first design he tried wrapped smooth wire around a fence rail. Seemed promising until he tested it with the neighbor's bull. The animal pushed right through in under a minute. The second design used sheet metal cut into sharp points. Better, but way too expensive, and the metal rusted almost immediately in the Illinois weather. But the third design made him stop and stare. 2 strands of wire, twisted together, with sharp barbs caught between them at regular intervals. Simple, elegant, and when he tested it, strong enough to give a curious cow serious second thoughts about pushing through. When Phineas Vaughan, the local blacksmith, saw what Glidden had created, he let out a low whistle. "Joseph," he said, running his fingers carefully along the twisted wire, "you've just invented the devil's rope. The devil's rope." Even Vaughan couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. But that's a story for another time. Right now, in that barn in DeKalb County, a grieving widower had just solved one of the fundamental problems of the American frontier. He'd created something that would fence the West, end the age of the open range, and ultimately change the very nature of land ownership in America. The question was, would the world be ready for what Joseph Glidden had unleashed? Spring of 1874 arrived in DeKalb County like a revelation. While other farmers were planting corn and watching the sky for rain, Joseph Glidden had transformed his barn into something that would have seemed like science fiction just months earlier, a factory for manufacturing the impossible. Picture this scene. Glidden, his daughter Elva, and 2 hired hands working 18-hour days in a converted barn that rattled and hummed with the sound of twisting wire. Steam from the blacksmith's forge mixed with the metallic screech of Glidden's modified coffee grinders now multiplied into a small assembly line of wire-twisting machines, 100 pounds of barbed wire daily. That might not sound like much until you realize that this was brand new technology, being invented as they went along. The design itself was deceptively simple, and that's what made it brilliant. 2 strands of wire, twisted together like a rope, with sharp barbs caught between them every 4 inches. Simple enough that any blacksmith could understand it, complex enough that it actually worked. But here's the thing about simple solutions to big problems: they invite competition faster than honey draws flies. Word of Glidden's wire spread across the prairie with the speed that only truly revolutionary ideas can achieve. Farmers would ride 20 miles just to see this devil's rope with their own eyes. They'd bring their most stubborn livestock to test it, and when 30 stampeding longhorns charged Glidden's test fence at full speed. These are animals that could knock down a wooden rail fence like matchsticks the wire held. Not just held, but barely even trembled. That's when things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean legally complicated in ways that would make modern patent lawyers weep with joy. Jacob Heisch, remember him from the county fair, the rancher who'd lost his prize bull, suddenly had a revelation. According to Heisch, he'd actually invented barbed wire first. In fact, he claimed he'd been working on the idea long before that autumn fair, long before Glidden ever twisted his first wire. Pure coincidence that his invention looked remarkably similar to Glidden's design. Within weeks, Heisch filed a competing patent. The legal battle that erupted would make the Hatfields and McCoys look like a friendly disagreement. 15 years. 15 years of courtroom warfare that cost over $1 million more money than some entire states had in their treasuries. Picture the scene in those Chicago courtrooms. Lawyers in starched collars, arguing with passionate intensity over the most minute details. Who first twisted wire? Who first added barbs? Who first thought to combine the two? Who deserved to become fantastically wealthy from this simple invention? Because by this point, everyone involved understood that whoever owned the legitimate patent to barbed wire would become richer than railroad barons. But here's where Glidden proved he was more than just a clever inventor. He was a strategic thinker. Remember Isaac Elwood, the hardware merchant who'd lost 200 cattle that summer? Glidden approached him with a proposition that would change both their lives forever. They formed the Barb Fence Company, combining Glidden's patent with Elwood's established distribution network. Think about the genius of this partnership. Glidden had the invention and the legal rights. Elwood had the business connections, the credit relationships with banks, and most importantly, he understood how to get products from factories to farmers across the vast distances of the American frontier. Together, they created something more powerful than either could have achieved alone, an empire built on twisted wire. By 1876, their factory in DeKalb was producing 10,000 miles of wire annually. 10,000 miles! That's enough to fence from New York to California and back again. But they weren't alone in the market, not by a long shot. Competitors sprouted like weeds after a spring rain. The Brinkerhoff design with its distinctive diamond-shaped barbs, the Alice variation that used ribbon wire instead of round, Kelly's diamond point that promised to be even more effective at deterring livestock. In just 5 years, over 400 patents were filed for various types of barbed wire. 400. Everyone and their brother thought they could improve on Glidden's basic concept, but here's the beautiful thing about market competition. The customers themselves became the judges. And the customers, those practical-minded ranchers and farmers, declared Glidden's winner design superior to all the flashy variations. Why? Because it worked. Day after day, season after season. It simply worked better than anything else. The real breakthrough came when a showman named John Gates, and if that name sounds familiar, it should, because this is the same John Gates who would later co-found what became U.S. Steel, decided to stage public demonstrations that were part science experiment, part circus act. Gates would construct a corral right in the middle of town, using nothing but Glidden's barbed wire. Then he'd bet $5,000 a fortune that could buy you a mansion in those days that a herd of ornery Texas Longhorns couldn't break through. Picture the crowds that gathered for these spectacles. Skeptical ranchers, curious townspeople, newspaper reporters, even traveling salesmen who smelled opportunity in the air. They'd watch as these massive animals, creatures that had evolved to survive on the open range, charged the wire fence with all the force they could muster. And they'd see those proud beasts stop short, bloodying their hides against the twisted steel, learning through painful experience that this new barrier was different from anything they'd encountered before. The age of open range was ending, one barb at a time, and everybody knew it. The Washburn and Moen Company of Massachusetts, America's largest wire manufacturer, saw the writing on the wall. They bought half interest in Glidden's patents for $60,000 cash plus future royalties. To put that in perspective, $60,000 in 1876 had the purchasing power of about $1.5 million today. Not bad for a schoolteacher from Illinois. But the royalties, that's where the real money was. Within 2 years of the Washburn deal, Glidden was earning over $200,000 annually, more than the President of the United States, more than most railroad tycoons, more than he could have imagined when he was sitting in that empty farmhouse, twisting wire between his fingers and wondering if his life still had purpose. His simple invention had become an empire. But empires, as any student of history knows, always come with a price. And the price for Glidden's twisted steel empire was about to be paid in blood on the Texas plains. Because when you give people the power to claim what's theirs and keep out what isn't, you're not just solving a farming problem. You're fundamentally changing the relationship between human beings and the land they live on, and not everyone was going to accept that change peacefully. 1883. Midnight on the Texas plains, and the darkness was alive with the sound of cutting wire. They called themselves the Blue Devils, masked riders who swept through the night like avenging angels, armed with heavy wire cutters and a righteous fury that burned hotter than prairie fire. In a single night in Navarro County, they cut 2,000 miles of fence. 2,000 miles. That's enough barbed wire to stretch from Texas to Canada, reduced to useless tangles of twisted metal in the space of 12 hours. The fence-cutting wars had begun, and they would tear the heart out of rural Texas. To understand what was happening, you have to understand what barbed wire represented to different groups of people. For the new settlers, farmers from Illinois and Ohio and Pennsylvania, who'd come west with dreams of owning their own land, barbed wire was salvation. It was the difference between prosperity and poverty, between keeping what you'd worked for and watching it disappear into the night. But for the old-time ranchers, the ones who'd been working cattle since before the Civil War, barbed wire represented something entirely different. It represented the end of a way of life that had existed for centuries. These were men who believed in what they called free grass, the idea that the prairie belonged to everyone and no one, that cattle should roam where they pleased, following the ancient rhythms of drought and plenty. Picture John Tullis, a rancher in Brown County who'd worked the same land for 30 years. He'd seen the buffalo herds give way to cattle, watched the Comanche raids end and the railroad arrive. He'd adapted to all of it. But then came the wire. Mile after mile of it, slicing across traditional grazing routes like scars across the landscape. One morning, Tullis found his prize Arabian stallion, a horse he'd raised from a colt, worth more than most men earned in a year, tangled in cut barbed wire. The animal's legs were shredded beyond any hope of healing. As Tullis loaded his Winchester and rode out seeking vengeance, he was transformed from a law-abiding rancher into something more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. The violence escalated with the terrifying speed that only comes when neighbors turn against neighbors. Near Albany, Texas, fence cutters armed with wire snips met armed guards hired by desperate farmers. The confrontation that followed left 3 men dead in the mesquite brush, their blood soaking into soil that had been fought over by Comanche and cavalry, Longhorn and Cowboy, and now farmer and rancher. Texas Ranger Captain Bill McDonald arrived in Albany to find a community at war with itself. These weren't strangers fighting over abstract principles. These were men who'd shared brandings and barn raisings, whose children had played together, whose wives had quilted side by side. Now they were sworn enemies, and MacDonald had seen enough frontier violence to know how these feuds ended. The economic damage was staggering. $20 million in destroyed fences, enough to build a city from scratch. Countless cattle scattered to the 4 winds, some never to be recovered. Entire communities torn apart as families chose sides in a war that seemed to have no end and no winners. Governor John Ireland, watching his state tear itself apart, called a special legislative session. The solution they came up with was typically Texan in its directness, making fence-cutting a felony punishable by 5 years in the state penitentiary. Cut wire, go to prison. Simple as that. But the human cost of the fence-cutting wars went deeper than dollars or even deaths. It reached into the very soul of what America was becoming. The Native American tribes found their world shrinking even faster than before. Chief Quanah Parker of the Comanche, the same Quanah Parker who'd led the last free bands of his people before finally accepting reservation life, spoke with bitter eloquence about wire that cuts the earth like white man's knife. The great buffalo herds, already reduced to scattered remnants, found their ancient migration routes blocked by endless miles of barbed wire. Animals that had followed the same paths for thousands of years suddenly faced barriers they couldn't understand or overcome. For the Mexican-American families who'd practiced communal grazing since the days of Spanish colonial rule, the wire represented a particularly cruel irony. These were people whose ancestors had worked cattle in Texas when it was still part of Mexico, who'd developed the techniques and traditions that made the cattle industry possible in the first place. Now they watched helplessly as their ancestral lands were carved into private kingdoms by newcomers who'd been in Texas for less than a generation. Joaquin Mendoza, whose family had worked cattle for 6 generations, found himself arrested for trespassing on land his grandfather had freely roamed. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He was being imprisoned for following traditions that predated the United States itself. And at the center of it all, like the eye of a hurricane, sat Joseph Glidden in his mansion in DeKalb, Illinois. Now 70 years old and wealthy beyond anything he could have imagined as a struggling schoolteacher, Glidden found himself receiving death threats from men who blamed him personally for the destruction of their way of life. Armed guards protected his estate. His mail was screened for explosives. The man who'd invented a simple solution to keep cattle where they belonged had become a target for the rage and desperation of an entire region. Yet Glidden wasn't entirely the villain his critics painted him to be. Quietly, without fanfare or publicity, he funded schools in fence-cut communities. He paid for hospitals to treat men injured in the conflicts his invention had helped create. When desperate ranchers wrote to him begging for some kind of solution to the violence, he often sent money anonymously. But when reporters cornered him and asked the question everyone wanted answered, did he regret his invention? Glidden's response revealed the complexity of his position. I gave men the power to protect what was theirs. What they did with that power was their choice. It was a response that satisfied no one and everyone at the same time. Because that's what barbed wire really was, power. The power to say, this is mine and that is yours. The power to end centuries of traditional land use with a few twists of steel. The power to transform the American West from a place of movement and flexibility into a place of boundaries and ownership. And like all power, it came with consequences that its creator never intended and couldn't control. The fence-cutting wars would eventually end, not because anyone won, but because everyone finally understood that the old ways were gone forever. The open range, the free grass, the idea that land belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it all, of that was disappearing as surely as the buffalo herds and the war parties. But the legacy of those violent years would linger long after the last fence cutter hung up his wire snips, because Glidden's invention had done more than solve a farming problem. It had changed the fundamental relationship between Americans and the land they lived on. And that change would ripple outward in ways that no one not Glidden, not the ranchers, not the politicians, could possibly foresee. Dawn, August 4th, 1914. Belgian frontier. German cavalry, the flower of the Kaiser's army, advanced toward France with the confidence of men who'd never known defeat. These were soldiers trained in the grand tradition of European warfare: swift charges, glorious battles, decisive victories. They expected to face Belgian defenders armed with rifles and artillery, maybe some hastily built earthworks. What they encountered instead was something born in an Illinois farmhouse 40 years earlier. Endless coils of barbed wire strung between wooden posts, glinting with morning dew like spider webs made of steel. Glidden's invention, designed to contain cattle on the American prairie, had evolved into something its creator never imagined. The fence that ended the Wild West's freedom had become the weapon that would end the age of heroic warfare forever. By the time the Great War ground to its bloody conclusion 4 years later, millions of men would die entangled in descendants of that simple, twisted wire Joseph Glidden had created to solve a farming problem. The bitter irony was complete, but Glidden wouldn't live to see it. Back in America, the old inventor spent his final years in the mansion his wire had built, watching his creation transform an entire continent. He was wealthy beyond measure. His estate would be worth $5 million when he died, a fortune that would make him a billionaire in today's money. But wealth hadn't brought him peace. From his study window, Glidden could see the changes his invention had wrought. The great cattle drives were ending, replaced by fenced ranches practicing scientific breeding. Where buffalo had once roamed in herds numbering in the millions, wheat fields now stretched to the horizon, each one protected by neat wire boundaries that declared ownership with mathematical precision. Cities sprouted at fence corners, shipping, points where controlled cattle met the expanding railroad network. The romantic cowboy of dime novels and Wild West shows was evolving into something more prosaic, a salaried employee working within defined pastures, his freedom circumscribed by the very wire that made his job possible. The transformation wasn't just economic, it was cultural, psychological, fundamental. America was learning to think in terms of mine and yours, in ways that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. The idea that every square foot of land should belong to someone, that boundaries should be permanent and enforceable, that property rights trumped traditional usage, all of this was being written into the American soul with twisted steel. When Joseph Glidden died in October 1906, at the age of 93, he left behind more than just a fortune. He left a changed world. His funeral in DeKalb drew thousands of mourners, including ranchers who'd traveled from as far away as Texas and Montana to pay their respects to the man who'd shaped their lives. The Glidden homestead, converted into a museum, became a monument to the American belief that any problem could be solved with enough ingenuity and determination. Visitors could see the workshop where it all began, complete with Lucinda's modified coffee grinder still mounted on its wooden bench. They could read letters from grateful ranchers whose lives had been transformed by 4 inches of twisted wire. Maria Santos wrote from New Mexico, "Your fence let me keep a garden. My children eat vegetables now." The simple gratitude in those words spoke to something profound, the way Glidden's invention had made possible the small-scale farming that fed growing communities across the West. Tom Morrison from Wyoming told a different story. "Lost my job riding open range, but my family has a real home now." The bittersweet acknowledgement that progress always came with a price, that the freedom of the open road had been traded for the security of defined boundaries. Modern economists, looking back with the perspective of more than a century, calculate that barbed wire accelerated Western development by 30 years, adding over $50 billion to America's agricultural output. $50 billion, a sum so vast it defies comprehension, all flowing from a grieving widower's late-night experiments with coffee grinders and wire. But Glidden's influence extended far beyond economics. The Glidden model identify a universal need, create a simple solution, protect it legally, distribute it widely became the template for American innovation. Thomas Edison studied Glidden's patent strategies when developing his own electrical inventions. Andrew Carnegie applied Glidden's manufacturing principles to steel production. In our own time, entrepreneurs from Bill Gates to Steve Jobs have followed the same basic pattern. Find a problem everyone has, solve it elegantly, and scale the solution globally. Today, satellite images reveal that Earth is wrapped in an estimated 5 million miles of barbed wire. 5 million miles enough to circle the planet 200 times, each strand a descendant of those first experimental twists in a kitchen in DeKalb County. From the cattle ranches of Argentina to the sheep stations of Australia, from the collective farms of the former Soviet Union to the game preserves of Africa, Glidden's twisted steel has left its mark on every inhabited continent. But perhaps the most profound legacy of barbed wire isn't economic or technological, it's philosophical. Glidden's invention forced humanity to confront a fundamental question that we're still grappling with today. When does protecting what's ours destroy what we share? The prairie that once belonged to everyone and no one was divided into precise rectangles, each owned by someone specific. The result was more productive agriculture, more efficient land use, more security for individual, the farmers and ranchers. But it also meant the end of commons, the shared spaces that had sustained both wildlife and human communities for millennia. In our own time, we're facing similar questions about digital commons, about global resources like the atmosphere and the oceans, about the balance between individual rights and collective needs. Every debate about privacy versus transparency, about intellectual property versus open source, about national sovereignty versus global cooperation, echoes the conflicts that barbed wire first brought to the American frontier. The twisted steel that made one man's ranch secure eventually made the entire world feel smaller, more divided, more precisely owned. Whether that was progress or loss depends on your perspective, your position, your place in the grand scheme of things. Joseph Glidden, sitting in his empty farmhouse in 1873, was just trying to keep his cattle from wandering away. He had no idea he was about to fence the world, and maybe that's the most American thing about his story, the way a simple solution to a local problem ended up reshaping global civilization. The devil's rope, indeed, but whose devil? and whose salvation? That question, like the wire itself, continues to twist through history, sharp enough to draw blood, strong enough to change everything it touches.